11, verses 1 and 3 through 7, 38 through 45. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "The illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is by God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." And although Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had been in the tomb 4 days. Then Jesus, greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been there 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I have you for having heard me. I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him.
Dear friends, this story from the Gospel of John, and we heard only 1/3 of it. I try to abbreviate that so that we don't go through the same experience like last Sunday when we heard the entire chapter. This story of the death and the resurrection of Lazarus downright demands to be treated in the spirit of Mark Twain biblical satires. I just hear Lazarus loudly and bitterly complaining. Now, I'm assuming the role of Lazarus, okay? I tell you, dying, that is a serious business. It is hardly ever pleasant. Almost everyone whom I know tries to postpone it. I also tried, hanging on the last threads of life, waiting anxiously for my friend Jesus, who could come and restore me back to health. But all in vain. He did not show up. And so I went through all those prescribed stages of active dying. And after I died and was buried, then he came. Then he finally came, and then he brought me back to life. Like, why? Why did he do it to me? After I went orderly through all that dying business, and after all those expenses with the funeral, undertakers don't return payments. After all, they buried me all right. But what bothers me most, I was done with dying. I had died all right, in a proper and pious manner. But now I will have to die the second time. Why did he do it to me? I will not wish it to my worst enemies. Well, I know. It is unfair to blame this resurrection mishap on Jesus. That would be overly simplistic and unjust to him, and not paying attention to the textual criticism. Because we can and we should blame it on evangelist John. It is his Jesus who let me die just to bring me to life again. You see, Jesus in the Gospel of John is unlike Jesus in all the other Gospels, unlike Jesus I knew. I still vividly remember Jesus teaching his disciples how to pray and warn them quite sternly against any grandstanding. And when you pray, do not be like those hypocrites. They certainly do like attention for their prayers. Truly, I tell you, they already got their reward. Prayers of disciples should be simple, humble, earnest petitions to God in just few words. But then, in our story from John, right before I was resurrected, you hear, and Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I say this for the crowd standing here so that they may know that you have sent me. Can you imagine anything more pretentious, self-aggrandizing? Please do not pray like this. This is not an example to be followed. This is not even how Jesus prayed. This is evangelist John using prayer as a vehicle to preach his message. And the same could be said about the rest of this entire story. John simply needed Jesus to come late so that there would be more time and opportunity to make Jesus preach John's message, and deliver some of his very memorable pronouncements. Like, for instance, we skipped over it. That is a message to Martha. I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? That's a very powerful message, friends. We heard that yesterday during the memorial service. Don't get me wrong, it is a marvelous message. But did he really need to kill me for that, even though I'm just a literary personality or character? In order to preach his message, evangelist John made Jesus to pray like an hypocrite. And even further, evangelist John turned Jesus into an heartless monster, spiritual vulture, who deliberately waits around until his friend dies in order to preach his sermon about resurrection. Was it really necessary? And to support his fabrication, John drops in so many verisimilitudes. He overloads his stories with so many details that it becomes outright suspicious. He was just making those details up. But there is a clear moral of this story. First of all, don't overload your stories with verisimilitudes. And more importantly, for your spiritual sanity, don't pray like Jesus in the Gospel of John. No. And don't preach like Jesus in the Gospel of John. You don't need to kill people, albeit being it literary characters. And be like those vultures I mentioned, waiting until they die to preach a message. But the evangelist John, seriously, in a different way, we can take him seriously. His story was a part of a broader early Christian folklore about me, Lazarus. A cloud of stories about death and resurrection. Here is a part preserved in another gospel, and I'll tell it to you in my own words. There was once a certain rich man, perfectly dressed and feasting every day. And at his gate, a homeless man covered with sores. That was me. His name was Lazarus. And I had happily eaten the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. But only dogs came to lick my wounds and my sores. Then the poor man died, and angels carried him to Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. While being tormented in the place of the dead, he looked up and saw in distance Abraham with Lazarus at his side. "Father Abraham," he cried, "have mercy on me. Send Lazarus at once to dip his finger in water and cool my lips. This flame is killing me." You see, he might be dead, but his manners did not change. But Abraham said, "Dear child, remember you have already consumed all your delicacies, while Lazarus received only hardships. Now Lazarus is being comforted and pampered, and you suffer pain. And besides, there is a great deep gap, abyss between us and you. There is no way to cross it, even if anyone wanted." And so the rich man said, "Then I beg you," he's changing a little. "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus," we are back again, commanding people around, but "send Lazarus to my father's house. I have 5 brothers. Lazarus must warn them so that they would not come to this horrible place." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They must listen to them." The rich man said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead suddenly came, they would change their hearts and their lives." Abraham said, "If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, how could they possibly be moved even if someone came from the dead. That is another part of those folklore stories in early church, that cloud of stories about Lazarus, legends which were in circulation around and among the early Christians. And now you know why my resurrection was such a big deal. And looking at the world around, you must acknowledge Abraham was wise and knowing. He is actually speaking for God in that story. All right? No resurrection, no coming from the dead would change the pompous, self-obsessed rich. You know, even the Easter resurrection, they turn into validation of their personal salvation's hopes, completely obscuring that it was first and foremost about divine vindication and divine justice. Oh no, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, how could they even listen to me?